From the silent repose of eternity, I am compelled to return to you once more. The whisper of division filling the vast expanse of our homeland has disturbed my spirit. A whisper as powerful as the winds that once foretold the storm of the Civil War, which drenched my beloved country in blood. And now, here she is before me, my beautiful America, once again, standing on the brink of great peril. My dear descendants, I have come to you once more to warn of an impending threat. When we founded America in our time, we laid in its foundation the most important principle, the guarantee of freedom and independence for every citizen of this country for all time. We left you a legacy of an ideal society where all people can live in peace and harmony. This ideal is democracy. And I am proud that this ideal was realized in my beloved America, and that you, dear Americans, have preserved it for so long. For a long time, America has been a leading example and a shining beacon of the free world for all other nations on the planet. Yes, it has been a difficult journey, with challenges and disagreements. Still, you have overcome them and managed to preserve our shared value, freedom. But what I see now makes my heart bleed. The legacy we left you is under immediate and severe threat. Today, our country and democracy around the world face the threat of complete destruction. A hidden enemy is now undermining the foundations of your free world. It is one step away from destroying it forever. This enemy doesn't wear a military uniform. It's not confined by borders or sworn allegiance to any flag. Its weapons are invisible, but its blows are devastating. The time has come to expose this hidden enemy, so that you can build your defenses before it delivers the final blow. That's why I have returned, to deliver a message to the people of America and all the free world. A message that will empower you to halt the relentless tide of impending events if you so choose. Each person who hears my message from beginning to end holds the power to shape the destiny of this world.
In the age of information, the most dangerous enemy lurks where it can't be seen. In the shadows of lies, manipulation, and distorted realities. In the shadows of disinformation. This enemy is waging an invisible, undeclared war against humanity, with our minds as the battlefield. Infoterrorism is its weapon. Mind control is its strategy. But what if we could see through the lies and expose its true face? This groundbreaking documentary, based on an extensive independent investigation into the activities of a transnational network of terrorist organizations, will reveal for the first time the methods of mass manipulation and the connections between major world events such as the 9/11 attacks, the epidemic of school shootings, the Waco tragedy, the war between Ukraine and Russia, the looming threat of the Fourth Reich's global dominance, the creation of modern concentration camps for prisoners of conscience, and the invisible genocide happening right now. Discover the hidden truths that will forever change your perspective on the world. This is more than a film. It is the most crucial documentary since the defeat of Nazism. It's the key to understanding our times. A puzzle that brings all the pieces together. Until now, you've only seen fragments. But today, the complete picture will become clear. Prepare for a global revelation, the triumph over an invisible enemy, and the dawn of a new era. An era where freedom and democracy prevail. The Impact is a film that doesn't just talk about history, but changes it. Chapter 1: The Enemy's Global Plan. May 2nd, 2024. According to data outlined in Rasmussen reports, 41% of American voters believe that a second civil war could occur in the United States in the next 5 years, including 16% who consider such a scenario very likely.
About a civil war. Civil war.
It is noted that today the level of tension in American society is at its highest since the time of the first Civil War in the United States.
Are we on the brink of another civil war?
Rates on mortgages.
Why are people still so obsessed with
Is a civil war ahead? Are we really facing a second civil war?
We are closer to civil war than any of us would like to believe.
The specter of a looming civil war has not arisen in your minds by mere chance, Americans. It has been deliberately implanted through specific psychological manipulations that you encounter daily amidst the vast flow of information and news. You believe you are simply reading various unrelated articles, but you fail to see that they are part of a single scheme, a unified plan of the enemy of democracy, systematically leading the entire world towards a new, unprecedented form of global totalitarianism. The first key strategic stage is to destroy America from within through an artificially provoked civil war. This will deliver a fatal blow to democracy, after which it will be easy for the hidden enemy to extinguish the remnants of freedom in other parts of the world. For there will be no strong nation left to stand against them in this geopolitical battle. On the ruins of democracy, chaos will initially reign. Still, it will be a controlled chaos, forcing people to crave totalitarian laws that promise order in exchange for their freedom. This is the second stage of the plan, the establishment of a new world disorder. After that, the enemy will move on to the last, final stage of their plan, the establishment of totalitarianism and the complete seizure of power throughout the world. A broken and divided society becomes the perfect breeding ground for the emergence of a new world order, an order controlled by a totalitarian enemy, an order that threatens the very essence of the freedom we have fought for so long. In this order, the majority of the population will become miserable slaves, living in concentration camps, while a small group of rulers will wield unlimited power over the rest of humanity. Now you are close to the point of no return, but it is still possible to prevent this scenario from unfolding. However, once you cross that line, the enemy will have gained enough strength and power to completely bring the world to its knees, leaving no room for action. Therefore, the time to change the course of events is now, and to confront the hidden enemy and win, you have to know him by sight. The time has come to expose their methods. Right now, a hidden war for the future of all humanity is being waged, with the battlefield being your very consciousness. In this war, the enemy's primary strategy is to execute their plans through your actions by influencing your thoughts, decisions, and actions with precisely calculated manipulative techniques. As a result, without even realizing it, you become traitors to your country, your people, your children, and even yourselves, merely by falling under the influence of the enemy's covert attack. What is his primary tool to turn a freedom-loving population into obedient executors of his will? This tool is terror, the terror that is used against you every day, but which you do not notice until it is too late.
The enemy's weapon is terror. The Latin word terror means fear or dread. This word first came into prominent use during the French Revolution of 1793-1794. This period was known as the Reign of Terror because public executions became widespread in France. In front of large crowds, a person's head was severed. The guillotine mainly targeted dissenters, those who deviated from the official stance of the time. The time and place of the executions were announced publicly in advance, and people were gathered specifically to witness the victim's suffering. However, the main targets and victims of terror were not the individuals under the guillotine. The main targets and victims of terror were all the people gathered in the square, and those to whom they would tell about it. By witnessing the act, they experienced immense fear and dread. This made people even more controllable by those perpetrating the terror. In addition, alongside the fear, people felt a deep sense of oppression. They understood that the majority of those who faced the guillotine were innocent, punished simply for holding views that threatened the power of the terror regime. At the same time, society was rife with denunciations and slander. Even the spread of trivial rumors about a person's actions or statements, which could be interpreted as contrary to the interests of the ruling power, led to execution. In other words, a simple rumor or gossip could result in an absolutely innocent person being publicly beheaded. Every observer in the crowd understood that the next head under the blade could be their own, as there were no guarantees of protection from this fate. This sense of fear, helplessness, and anxiety led people to completely lose trust in the government and foster a deep hatred for the authorities. This, in turn, led to new waves of protests and mass unrest. The population, having become victims of terror, became the raw material for the creation of subsequent controlled chaos. What is terrorism?
Nowadays, the enemy doesn't need to gather you in squares and publicly execute someone to make you victims of terror. Why? Because it has invented a more efficient form of terrorism that has a similarly powerful and long-lasting influence on you. This is the most sophisticated kind of terrorism. Its danger is that you do not recognize it as terrorism, so you cannot protect yourself against it. It is precisely in your era that the enemy can exploit it, in the age of technology when people have quick access to information, and it can spread rapidly. I'm now talking about psychological and informational terrorism. Some of you might be surprised. When you hear the word terrorism, stereotypical images immediately come to your mind. A bomb exploding in a crowded square, shootings, taking of hostages at mass events, or airplanes crashing into skyscrapers. In most cases, you even picture an image of a terrorist of a specific nationality and religion. However, few people know that the enemy has intentionally narrowed your understanding of terrorism to these images in order to distract you from other forms of terrorism and its essence. This means you won't be able to recognize other kinds of terrorist attacks that are carried out against you every day. What is the real danger of informational terrorism?
Informational terrorism is a direct influence on the psyche and consciousness of people to shape desired opinions and judgments that guide people's behavior. It's a form of negative influence on individuals, society, and the state through various types of information, aiming to weaken and destabilize the constitutional order.
Nowadays, simply scrolling through the news feed in your gadget in the morning can make you a victim of informational terrorism. Murders, shootings, persecutions, slander, suffering of innocent people, story after story. You listen, read, and watch as innocent people in various parts of the world, public figures, groups of people, international organizations, religious and political entities, and even government officials are subjected to hatred, groundless discreditation, brutal persecution, and public punishments. It's unfair, unjust, and inhumane. Yet, government institutions allow this to happen and often participate in those repressions themselves. Each of such stories is an act of terrorism aimed against you and your countries. It is crucial to understand that not every negative news story or unpleasant piece of information you encounter in the media is an act of informational terrorism. Informational terrorist acts are not just a chaotic spread of negative information. Unlike ordinary bad news, acts of informational terrorism carried out by the enemy of democracy are always meticulously planned and systematic. An informational terrorist attack is always a targeted and organized campaign aimed at achieving specific goals. The ultimate goal of an informational act of terrorism is to instill a sense of helplessness and fear in society, and most importantly, to create conditions where the population, meaning all of you, would begin to distrust your country's leadership. Later on, you will learn how the enemy uses informational terrorist attacks to destabilize the constitutional order in your countries. Informational terrorism purposely targets your subconsciousness, bypassing critical thinking. It's a whole scheme of influencing your mind and psyche, which the enemy itself developed. Through informational terrorist attacks, the enemy has been breaking your psyche and that of billions of other people for many years, causing division among you. Informational acts of terrorism conducted through the media have two types of consequences, internal and external. Let's start by examining the internal consequences: destruction of your mental and physical health.
Cardiovascular diseases have been the leading cause of death worldwide for 20 years and remain at the top of the list of the 10 leading causes of death. However, they never claimed as many lives as they do nowadays. WHO has indicated these diseases to be the main cause of death globally over the past 2 decades. According to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, about 697,000 people died from cardiovascular diseases in the USA in 2020, which makes up 1 in every 4 deaths. In Europe, the European Society of Cardiology, ESC, reports that cardiovascular diseases cause about 4 million deaths annually, making up almost half of all deaths on the continent. In Russia, cardiovascular diseases accounted for over 45% of all deaths in the country in 2021. Why, despite the advancement of healthcare and the implementation of new technologies, does the problem not only persist, but continue to aggravate? While many risk factors are named, the primary cause is frequent or chronic stress. Stress is a fear for one's life and safety. In present-day society, people have become accustomed to this kind of fear as an integral part of their lives. However, what causes this constant stress? And how have people been kept in this state for more than 30 years? The root cause of continuous stress is the numerous informational terrorist attacks that people worldwide are subjected to every day through the media. The impact of the informational acts of terrorism on human health has been thoroughly studied and scientifically proven. Let's look at the facts discovered by the Department of Psychology and Social Behavior of the University of California. Alison Holman and her colleagues from the University of California, Irvine collected data on the mental state of about 5,000 Americans for their study. This data collection was completed right before the Boston Marathon bombing on April 15, 2013, where hundreds of people were injured. Mass media extensively covered the incident, repeatedly showing footage of the explosion, the ensuing horror, and people's deaths. They also published harrowing photos, blood-stained sidewalks, people who lost their limbs, and many other frightening images. A few weeks after the attack, the researchers decided to assess changes in the mental state of those people whom they had previously surveyed, following the Boston tragedy. It was no surprise that the mental health of those present at the scene of the terrorist act had significantly deteriorated. However, the researchers discovered something unexpected. The psyche of those surveyed who were not present at the tragedy site, but later watched the news about it, suffered much more. The high level of stress those people experienced wasn't related to them personally, knowing anyone who had died, had been injured, or present at the explosion site. Their stress was solely due to the constant stream of information released by the media. Another study proved that repeated media coverage of the Boston Marathon bombing caused more acute stress in those who watched and read about it, compared to the direct influence of the terrorist attack on those who were at the explosion site. Moreover, it became obvious that media coverage of such events could rapidly spread acute stress among a large number of people. A number of studies confirms that exposure to traumatic content can activate fear circuits in the brain and trigger memories, the two key processes linked to the development of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Similarly, repeated coverage of traumatizing stories in mass media can prolong acute distress. Unlike collective trauma that can fade over time, media exposure maintains an acute stress response by keeping traumatic memories active in a person's consciousness. This can contribute to continuous replaying of the same anxious or depressive thoughts or memories. These kinds of thoughts themselves can induce stress even when there is no immediate cause for concern. Such mental rumination worsens a person's psychological state and influences their physical health. Extensive media coverage makes local disasters more widely known, spreading their influence beyond the incident area and turning them into public traumas with negative health consequences. For example, television coverage of the Oklahoma City bombing, the Waco tragedy, and the events of September 11th caused widespread PTSD among people. Let's consider the findings of another study. Research on the consequences of the 9/11 terrorist attack found that acute stress reactions to the events of September 11th, 2001, caused a 53% increase in cardiovascular diseases in the following 3 years. Within a few weeks after September 11th, 2001, there was a significant rise in cardiovascular diseases in New York and surrounding areas. The same was observed in Florida, suggesting that people who experienced stress from watching the terrorist attacks in mass media developed health problems. Moreover, similarly to the Boston bombing case, people who suffered from distress were neither participants nor direct witnesses of the attack. They simply received information about the events of September 11th through the media.
We're just getting reports in now that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center.
2 planes have crashed into the World Trade Center in New York.
There have been a series of terrorist attacks in the United States.
All of this indicates a direct link between informational terrorist attacks in mass media and deterioration of people's health. Today, many studies focus on the influence of negative information on human mental and physical health. Research on the aftermath of numerous crises has led to the conclusion that the more manipulative news a person consumes, the higher the likelihood they will develop symptoms of stress, anxiety, and PTSD. Prolonged deep stress weakens the immune system, leaving a person without internal protection, while the decline in immunity is a trigger for subsequent deterioration of physical health. Studies have shown that continuous mental processing of fear and anxiety-inducing information from informational terrorist acts significantly affects the cardiovascular, endocrine, and immune systems. This contributes to the development of related diseases: acute myocardial infarction, sudden cardiac arrest, ischemic heart disease, heart failure, and arrhythmia. Chronic stress increases the risk of stroke fourfold, contributes to the development of diabetes and cancer, and greatly increases the risk of depression and suicide. All of these indicators have drastically surged over the past 30 years. The purpose of any terrorist act is to destabilize society as a whole. This is achieved by inducing severe stress and fear. Constant stress leads to deterioration of the mental and physical health of a huge number of people. Through informational acts of terrorism, the stability of society's life is undermined. This undeclared informational and psychological war has been going on for years and has claimed more lives worldwide than the 2 previous world wars combined. Considering that cardiovascular diseases alone, which are the leading cause of death worldwide, kill 17.9 million people annually, and adding 10 million deaths a year from cancer with 20 million new cancer cases every year, the scale of this terrorist impact is tremendous. The most alarming fact is that the majority of people are unaware of the true cause of this massive genocide, of this crime against humanity.
What you've just heard are well-known facts. Analysis of these facts indicates that it is the informational terrorist activities of the enemy of democracy that have caused such horrifying consequences. The only explanation for such a sharp rise in psychological and physical ailments is the actions of humanity's main enemy. As a matter of fact, America repeatedly faced political and economic stresses, even the Civil War, without seeing a similar rise in various diseases. And this trend is not confined to America, it is worldwide. Analyzing data from democratic countries, we can see a clear pattern. In regions where this enemy has been active in mass media, the health situation is just as alarming. Please note that the rise in diseases has been particularly notable in the last 30 years. That's no coincidence. It was 30 years ago that the enemy of the democratic world gained strength and began its activities. However, I'll go back to this and give you more detail later. As I mentioned earlier, the informational terrorist attacks carried out by the enemy through the media have two types of consequences, internal and external ones. Now you know that diseases are internal manifestations of informational acts of terrorism. So it is time to discuss the external consequences, civil unrest, strikes, and revolutions. I will now explain how the enemy of democracy destabilizes society and your countries through informational acts of terrorism. Any informational act of terrorism carries lies, manipulation, and incitement to hatred or violence. By means of informational terrorist attacks, the enemy instills destructive beliefs into your subconsciousness, filling you with fear and eroding your patriotism. How does this happen? First, you witness an informational attack in mass media. It can be about anything. For example, a story with false accusations against individuals, whether they are politicians, business people, believers, or supporters of some political parties.
Accused of
facing persecution.
People have been arrested.
Get arrested.
It's a human rights violation.
Human rights violation of our generation.
Human rights violation.
And systematic violation of human rights.
On the one hand, you trust the media that broadcasts this story. But on the other hand, you understand that the accusations are baseless and violate the presumption of innocence. This causes an inner conflict in you, robbing you of peace and a sense of security. You start fearing that you might be the next to have your rights violated. You subconsciously realize that if the laws fail to protect someone, they won't protect you next time either. The fact that authorities either break the law or fail to respond to its violation means only one thing to you: that authorities support those violations, which generates fear and distrust. An individual who observes it all goes through several stages of reaction. First stress and rejection, and then hatred towards the authorities. The final stage is a loss of patriotism, because he doesn't understand why he should defend a state that doesn't protect him. The person decides to defend only himself. He makes the following conclusion: I witnessed a crime on national television. Authorities are idle and support this crime, which means they intentionally break the laws and are behind those violations. Authorities want to deprive me of my legal rights and freedoms, hence they are a threat to me. People always strive to eliminate the source of their constant stress and fear. As a result, when authorities become an enemy to the people, people express their distrust and protest through demonstrations and strikes, which lead to revolutions. However, even after a change in the government, the situation does not resolve, and an individual continues to experience severe stress. Because, regardless of the party affiliation of the new government, the enemy of the democratic world remains in the shadows, continuing its informational terrorist attacks, and the whole cycle begins anew. Informational terrorism will always target current authorities in order to destabilize society and weaken the constitutional order in a chosen democratic country through the actions of its own people. In addition, the enemy of democracy simultaneously carries out numerous informational terrorist attacks aimed at dividing citizens among themselves. The enemy incites hostility and hatred in society by first dividing, then pitting various groups against each other, and broadcasting this conflict through the media, manipulating human consciousness in this way. The enemy forces you to believe that you, the citizens in this country, are enemies to each other through acts of xenophobia, extremism, and terrorism. The enemy artificially generates hatred towards a chosen group of people, nationality, race, or community, embedding a lasting negative perception of them in your subconscious. Globally, the enemy's actions lead to a situation where, due to continuous internal destabilization, social order gives way to chaos, and democratic laws cease to function. Ultimately, this most often results in civil war, which completely destroys what was once a free country. This is precisely what the enemy of democracy aims for, as it thus gains more power and brings closer global totalitarianism. The most alarming thing is that the enemy accomplishes it, all through your actions, merely by instilling the necessary beliefs. For this very reason, informational and psychological terrorist attacks are more terrifying than physical ones, for they directly influence your subconsciousness, bypassing critical thinking. Thus, when destroying your own country, you will believe that you act for the benefit, consciously, and according to your inner convictions. In order to create provocative informational acts of terrorism and flood global media with them, the enemy of democracy uses its numerous branches, tentacles that penetrate various sectors of society and disguise themselves as mainstream information agendas. Today, using one of the enemy's many branches as an example, I will show you how it operates and explain why it is vital for each of you to be aware of this. One of those branches is a network of international criminal terrorist organizations. These organizations, which I will discuss later on, became the subject of an investigation that revealed the main patterns, methods, and tools used by the hidden enemy in its war against humanity. The results of this investigation, which lasted a whole 10 years, have been made public by Dr. Egon Cholakian, an American intelligence educator and national security expert. As part of the international investigation, on June 22, 2023, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution on the 8th review of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. In this resolution, the General Assembly provided the most comprehensive definition of terrorism and identified activities that essentially constitute terrorism.
Terrorism includes any activity aimed at achieving the following goals: denial of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and democracy; incitement to commit terrorist acts and acts of violence that spread hatred and threaten human lives; creating threats to the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of states; impeding the enjoyment of political, civil, economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to life, liberty, and security; destabilizing governments. This resolution calls for combating any manifestation of terrorism.
Thanks to such a comprehensive definition of terrorism, the enemy can no longer hide its incessant terrorist attacks. So, why have I focused specifically on this branch of the enemy, the network of international criminal terrorist organizations? Because this branch is well studied, and its organizations use the same key methods and tools as those applied by other branches, which the enemy has created for establishing global totalitarianism. Once you understand the enemy's actions in one field, you will be able to recognize them in all other fields as well. This means that all the schemes that the enemy can only implement in secrecy will stop working as they become obvious. This network of international criminal terrorist organizations uses methods of informational terrorism, cloaking itself with government authorities and democratic laws. Those organizations do not fear publicity since their activities are usually not evaluated by society critically. Very few people even know that those organizations exist, observing only the tragic outcome of their activities. They remain out of the public eye, yet, being a part of the enemy's unified scheme, they represent a crucial link in achieving the enemy's global goal, the destruction of democracy in America and the entire democratic world. This network of international criminal terrorist organizations is a vital component in the enemy's scheme because those organizations operate openly. They are like a litmus test for democracy. Where they operate, democracy no longer exists, and where they appear, democracy will soon vanish. I am speaking about anti-cult organizations that represent a well-organized transnational terrorist network.
Chapter 2: Transnational Terrorist Network of Anti-Cult Organizations.
You'll be surprised to know how many tragic events worldwide are behind the anti-cult movement. Using special manipulative methods, they are currently preparing American society for a full-scale civil war. And now you will find out how it's being done.
Hidden mechanisms of inciting hatred.
Dear Americans, you see and feel the presence of an unprecedented huge division in present-day American society. I'm sure you understand perfectly well where it all leads to, and you already suspect that there are hidden mechanisms used against you to incite hatred in American society. What are those mechanisms? Who uses them and why? Who teaches Americans to hate and demonize each other, seeking to ignite a second civil war in our country? And how actively is this being done? You will now receive answers to these questions. Dear Americans, you will find out exactly how you are being led today from the point where you are peacefully sitting on a couch and watching a movie together with your friends, to the point where you would be ready to take up arms against those same friends just because they have a different opinion. Perhaps this idea seems unimaginable to you now, but you will see how manipulative methods are already artificially guiding you towards that. One of the main methods that the enemy of democracy uses nowadays, both against you and against the whole world, provoking hatred in societies in various countries and unleashing regional conflicts and global wars, is the method of dehumanization. By deliberately dehumanizing one group of people in the eyes of another, people are turned into haters of their colleagues and neighbors, and even into their potential killers, which is far worse. In order to attain dehumanization and division in society, the enemy uses the tactics of stigmatization and labeling, and one of the labels the enemy uses in its global bloody game with human lives is the word cult. You'll be shocked to discover how much suffering the deliberate use of the degrading label cult or sect has caused to people, and how many tragedies it has brought and keeps bringing to the American people and the world as a whole. At first glance, it seems that these are just words. However, with the help of these very labeling words, America is now being driven closer to civil war, while the entire global community is being led to World War III. Who uses these labels, and why, and how are they used as weapons of mass destruction?
Today, a well-coordinated transnational terrorist network operates in the international arena, the purpose of which is to incite hatred both within countries and in the global community, by labeling certain groups of people as a cult or a sect, through mass media and information space. The criminal network engaged in this form of information terrorism is the anti-cult movement. The anti-cult movement includes a number of organizations and individual activists who trigger public persecution of groups which they label as cults or sects. Based on their subjective biases and arbitrary criteria, anticultists can classify any existing association of people as a cult or a sect, thus subjecting it to dehumanization and public hatred. The core of their activity lies in organized influence on the media space for the purpose of generating a negative perception of a particular targeted group of people. Using the word cult or sect as their main weapon, adherents of the anti-cult movement carry out regular information terrorist attacks. They generate news stories that cause moral panic, societal division, and dehumanization of law-abiding citizens. Through their activities, representatives of the anti-cult movement incite mass hatred and violence and increase social hostility and tension in society, which actually makes their activities a brutal manifestation of information terrorism.
Most often, new religious movements and ideological group entities initially became victims of anti-cult terrorism. Commercial, secular, and political organizations with a pronounced ideological basis were also regularly included in the black list, maintained by Anticultists. However, today, entire nations and countries, including the United States, are already becoming targets of their atrocities. Using the term cult or sect, they create conditions for directing public hatred at their chosen target. The purposeful use of the terms cult and sect is part of a long-term strategy of the anti-cult movement, which resulted in the emergence of a number of destructive phenomena in American society, including school shootings. A little bit later, I'll reveal to you the chain of events where the use of the labels cult and sect led to a situation when children are now shooting other children.
Why is cult a key word in the activities of anti-cultists, and why is it so dangerous? The term cult, which is more common in the US, and the term sect used in Europe and post-Soviet countries, didn't initially have a negative meaning, but rather a neutral and culturological one. However, through the efforts of anti-cultists, the situation has changed. In the course of their hectic activities, representatives of the anti-cult movement gradually endowed the concepts of cult and sect with an increasingly negative connotation. Due to their activity, today the terms cult and sect are associated in mass consciousness with such notions as brainwashing, psychological violence, sexual violence, criminal activity, and mass suicide. It is precisely with the words cult and sect that massive information terrorism begins nowadays, carried out by anti-cult organizations and their representatives. James Richardson, a prominent figure in American sociology of religion, who is regarded as one of the most outstanding experts in the field of law and religion in the world, notes that contemporary usage of the term cult has evolved into a term of contempt or humiliation, and is no longer a neutral designation of a religious group. Nowadays, the term cult carries a value-laden set of derogatory stereotypes. The use of this term leads to stigmatization, discrimination, and violence against religious minorities, as well as social and political associations. Moreover, today the words cult and sect are impregnated with negative connotations to such an extent that they become catalysts for terrorist attacks and even genocide. Richardson and a number of other sociologists and researchers of religions, such as Baron van Driel, Stuart Wright, and others, point out that the term cult or sect is disparaging and conveys a stereotype which has serious consequences when applied to groups of people. Labeling a group as a cult or a sect can be an excuse for the government to attack the group and ultimately destroy it.
Despite the fact that reputable world scientists warn that the use of the word cult or sect causes great harm to people and should be avoided, especially in academic literature and court proceedings, representatives of the anti-cult movement continue to actively exploit this label and propagate it through the media, turning magazines and newspapers into mouthpieces of their hateful rhetoric.
When claiming that someone belongs to a cult or a sect, anti-cultists base their accusations not on academic papers or legal investigations, but on their own dubious and abstract concept of brainwashing. This idea has no scientific ground and is extremely vague. Nevertheless, exactly on the basis of the unreliable concept of brainwashing, anti-cultists label targeted groups and organizations as cults or sects. Brainwashing is an unscientific concept where the so-called cults and sects are accused of rigidly controlling the consciousness of their participants, which is why people can allegedly turn into zombies due to manipulation of their beliefs, thoughts, and behavior. Not only is this concept untenable, but it is also extremely dangerous as it leads to dehumanization. When society believes that an individual has been brainwashed, people stop regarding him as a sane individual. Instead of a human with his own thoughts and decisions, others begin to perceive him as a zombie or a puppet. Meanwhile, with such a perception of a person or a group of people, it is much easier to use violence against them. Forensic psychologist Dick Anthony states that the concept of brainwashing and the fear associated with it are used by the anti-cult movement as a tool to justify persecution of religious minorities. The court determined that the concept of brainwashing cannot be applied as a legal charge since it is untenable and unscientific. However, despite this, American anti-cultists continue to actively promote the concept of brainwashing to justify their sadistic practice of forcible deprogramming, meaning forced renunciation of beliefs, which among other things brought them commercial benefits. The destructive concepts of brainwashing and deprogramming have been introduced and are actively promoted by henchmen of the enemy of democracy in America, representatives of the anti-cult movement. The two figures who are especially notable for their cruelty and inhumanity and who spread the enemy's narratives on American territory are anti-cultists and deprogrammers Stephen Hassan and Rick Alan Ross. Currently, they are actively engaged in public activities and speak in American mass media, where they propagate the rhetoric of anti-cult terrorism, violence, and hatred. Deprogramming. Both Ross and Hassan were active members of the anti-cult organization Cult Awareness Network, CAN, which ceased to exist in 1996, as it was convicted of a number of gross violations of human rights and severe religious discrimination. The organization went bankrupt and paid compensation to the people who had suffered from it. Being the leading members of this organization in the 1980s and 90s, both Rick Ross and Stephen Hassan were actively involved in its primary criminal activity, arranging and carrying out forcible deprogramming processes. Deprogramming is an illegal anti-human practice rooted in Nazi methods. When practicing deprogramming, anti-cultists would unlawfully abduct and forcibly detain a person whom they considered to be a cult member or a sectarian. In the process of deprogramming, the victim was subjected to psychological and physical torture to force them to change their beliefs. Deprogramming was done on a commercial basis. Anti-cultists charged a fairly high fee from the victim's relatives for their forcible re-education services, during which a person usually underwent torture, torments, beatings, and various forms of violence, including sexual violence. Since this practice severely violated human rights, the founder of this method, Ted Patrick, appeared in court many times and served prison terms. In a number of trials, courts have ruled that deprogramming is illegal. Rick Ross, the American anti-cultist, performed more than 500 forcible deprogramming sessions in his life. In 1991, Ross was charged with unlawful detention and forcible deprogramming of Jason Scott, a member of the United Pentecostal Church International, UPCI, whose mother was referred to Ross by representatives of CAN. Scott later filed a civil suit against Ross, two of his associates in CAN in federal court. In September 1995, a 9-member jury unanimously held the defendants, Ross and his accomplices, liable for conspiracy to deprive Scott of his civil rights and religious liberties. In addition, the jury held that Ross and his associates, quote, intentionally or recklessly acted in a way so outrageous in character and so extreme in degree as to go beyond all possible bounds of decency and to be regarded as atrocious and utterly intolerable in a civilized community. Ross's criminal activities in this abduction case resulted in the closure of the Cult Awareness Network, which was exposed as a criminal network for kidnappers. The story of Scott, who became a victim of brutal deprogramming arranged by Ross, is striking in its cruelty. He was abducted using physical force. They knocked him down to the ground, dragged him into a van, handcuffed him, taped his mouth, and tied his legs. During the abduction, a 300-pound man sat on Scott's back. Scott's legs, upper body and back, suffered multiple bruises and abrasions when he was being dragged into the van by stairs, on the floor, and through a patio. Scott was detained in a specially equipped prison house under constant supervision. For 5 days, he was subjected to psychological pressure. They insulted his faith and threatened him. Ross regularly hit Scott on the head when they argued about religion. Scott was promised freedom only if he would give up his beliefs. A detailed study of the effective cases of deprogramming carried out by Rick Ross reveals the terrible truth. Many of those cases were accompanied by destruction of families and complete dehumanization of the victims. The people whom he allegedly helped in this way were subjected to coercion, deception, and humiliation. They were deprived of their right to free choice and forced to renounce deeply rooted religious beliefs. These people who were broken and lost faith became living evidence of the cruelty and treachery of Ross's methods. His demonstrative successes in deprogramming were covered with a shadow of ruined destinies and irreparable psychological traumas. Ross used people's fears and weaknesses with cold logic in order to profit from their troubles, demonstrating complete indifference to the suffering he caused. His actions are clearly characterized by violence, cruelty, and cold-bloodedness that turn people's misfortune into a source of his own benefit. The second figure and henchman of anti-cult movement in America is deprogrammer Steven Hassan. American mass media give him a platform to speak as a cult expert, but they do not mention that Steve Hassan's expertise is violent abuse against American citizens and their civil rights.
Hassan was an accomplice in the Cult Awareness Network. This anti-religious hate group served as a national referral service for so-called deprogrammers. They ran a racket to kidnap, assault, and traumatize law-abiding men and women for profit, all to coerce them into recanting their religious beliefs. And Steve Hassan is a notorious deprogrammer. Hassan led the squad that traumatized one adult victim, Arthur Roselle, for 2 weeks to try and break the man's faith. In sworn testimony, Roselle recounted his physical and mental assault. Hassan's team threw him to the floor, cutting and bruising his face. They bound his hands and feet and held him captive for days on end. They deprived him of sleep and violated his privacy and basic dignity. When Roselle refused to recant his religious beliefs, Hassan threatened to inject him with shots. And to add insult to injury, Hassan tried to induce his victim to lie and commit perjury about the crime. Then there was the testimony of Lauren Sala. Hassan's team broke into her motel room, threw her from the bed, and threatened to break her leg if she called for help or tried to escape. They took her hostage and drove her to a remote hideaway, where they imprisoned her for 8 days, trying to break her faith. When Hassan's thugs failed, he tormented Salah for 3 more days, until she managed to negotiate her release. Another of Hassan's victims, Claire Kelly, also testified that Hassan unlawfully held her captive. He had her held in a room with no knobs on the windows, kept her under 24-hour guard, and violated her privacy. Hassan pawned himself off as a, quote, expert on religions in court cases, bilking unsuspecting families for his so-called expert testimony, until courts caught on to his crackpot theories. Hassan would continue his anti-religious assaults, now under the name of intervention.
It is excessively alarming and suspicious that despite documented evidence that both Hassan and Ross are violent individuals prone to sadism, who lack empathy and have an unhealthy desire to harm people and incite hatred in society, they continue to appear on America's mainstream TV channels. There, their articles are published in leading periodicals, and mass media are guided by their opinions. A legitimate question arises: who is behind them and ensures their immunity? What is the force that manipulates and supports them? After all, in the beginning of their work before the early 90s days, neither Rick Ross nor Stephen Hassan were of much interest with their theories. However, starting from 1993, the media and even the FBI suddenly began to turn to them for advice. Did they conduct their destructive activities and perform deprogramming sessions simply because they were maniacs? Or did their actions contribute to implementation of a clearly defined plan of the enemy of democracy, which has brought America to the current state of panic and division? Both statements are true. The global enemy regarded the manic potential of these two fellows as a suitable material for turning them into its pawns, who are easy to manipulate and whose hands can destroy America from within. Activities of American representatives of the anti-cult movement are part of a planned strategy. Both Steve Hassan and Rick Ross are executors of the plans of America's enemy. What they currently implement, continuing to promote and impose the ideology of hatred and division, is nothing but information terrorist attacks aimed against the American population and against the USA as a country. Even though they stopped using violent deprogramming techniques with their own hands, they receive support from the global enemy of democracy. So today, they continue deprogramming on an even larger scale and against a greater number of innocent law-abiding citizens. It's just that now, they are not doing it with their own hands, but with your hands and the hands of law enforcement agencies. A vivid illustration is that 30 years ago, in the early 90s, the number of violent raids on new religious movements increased dramatically and inexplicably for many people. Research that established this fact included statistics from 19 different countries, including the USA, Israel, and Western European countries. Wondering about the reasons behind such an upsurge, researchers traced a mobilization of anti-cult organizations, which occurred during that very period of time. However, the main essence and cause remained hidden for the researchers. The clue is that during this period of time, to be more precise in 1993, the global enemy of democracy activated its ideological center of the anti-cult movement, which has been located in Russia since that moment to this day. It is exactly from there that commands are given from, and a single ideological vector is set for the entire anti-cult movement worldwide, extending to its entire network. Now, using the example of this ideological center, let's discuss in detail how it operates in the country that it has turned into a testing ground for practicing its methods, which it plans to transfer and apply throughout the world in the near future.
ideological center of anti-cult groups. The ideological center of the entire transnational network of contemporary anti-cult movement, and the chief developer of its propaganda methods, is the Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects, abbreviated as RATSEERS. The basis of RATSEERS is the Center for Religious Studies in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus of Lyon, established in 1993. This center was founded by the Anticultist Alexander Dvorkin with the blessing of the then Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Alexei II. RATSEERS representatives cover their activities under the guise of an allegedly noble mission of defending the interests of the country's titular religion, namely Orthodox Christianity. However, the real situation is far more complicated. Within the religion itself, there are individuals who, while outwardly adhering to orthodoxy, actually support anti-cult movements. These individuals act in unison, pursuing their own goals and benefits, which have nothing to do with religion itself. Therefore, it's crucial to distinguish between religion as a system of values and beliefs, and those who have infiltrated it with malicious intent to use it as a cover for their destructive activities. These anti-cult operatives and their allies within the Russian Orthodox Church have turned this country into a staging ground for their activities and launched a targeted terrorist attack on democratic countries from there. The radical ideology of RATSEERS, which originated in Russia, now extends its influence far beyond its borders. Anti-cult organizations hold particularly strong positions in China, France, and Germany, where they have secured significant support from authorities or individual representatives. This support allows them to exert influence over legislative, judicial, and law enforcement bodies. One of the prominent representatives of this international terrorist network is the European Federation of Centers for Research and Information on Sectarianism, FECRIS, headquartered in Paris. France, a country with a long tradition of democracy, has unexpectedly become part of the criminal anti-cult movement scheme, with 90% of FECRIS's activities funded by the state budget. Additionally, anti-cult activities are institutionalized in France through the Interministerial Commission Miviludes. However, the actions of this commission, as well as those of FECRIS, have repeatedly faced criticism from the international community, including for employing violent deprogramming methods, forcing individuals to renounce their beliefs through literal tortures, against members of various religious groups. Both FECRIS and RATSEERS comprise a number of organizations. The FECRIS and RATSEERS networks are closely interconnected. They operate under a unified policy, use identical methods, and maintain close relationships. For instance, Alexander Dvorkin, president of RATSEERS and Russia's leading anti-cultist, also served as vice president of FECRIS and still remains a member of its board of directors. Additionally, RATSEER's vice president and Dvorkin's associate, Orthodox archpriest Alexander Novopashin, is also a corresponding member of FECRIS. Currently, the participation of RATSEER's representatives within FECRIS has been officially suspended. This was done to conceal the influence of Russian participants on FECRIS's ideology and to avoid accusations of active support for Russian propaganda against Ukraine during the escalation of the military conflict between these two countries. Despite their official charters, claiming adherence to international conventions on human rights and freedoms, the reality is that anti-cult organizations operate in a starkly different manner. Since their inception, these anti-cult organizations have repeatedly discredited themselves through anti-democratic and unlawful activities, which include the deliberate spread of lies and slander, intentional incitement of violence, the use of destructive manipulative techniques, the instigation of conflicts fueled by interreligious hatred, and the targeted persecution of dissenting groups, sometimes even leading to physical assaults. Officially, the anti-cult umbrella organization FECRIS includes groups based in Europe, while RATSEERS encompasses organizations in Russia and the CIS countries. Both associations actively collaborate with anti-cultists from the United States. American anti-cultist Stephen Hassan has attended conferences organized by FECRIS. Hassan was also a guest lecturer at one of educational clubs in Russia, where the anti-cultist Alexander Dvorkin is a regular lecturer too. Moreover, Hassan has repeatedly traveled to Russia with his lectures at the invitation of Russian anti-cultists. Dvorkin published a book titled 10 Questions to an Obtrusive Stranger, which entirely mirrored a chapter from Hassan's book. Moreover, Dvorkin actively recommends Hassan's books, and their rhetoric about the dangers of cults is identical, often echoing each other word for word. This synchronization of narratives indicates regular information exchange and collaboration, suggesting a direct and close relationship between Hassan and Dvorkin. A closer examination reveals the influence of the anti-cult ideological center on both social and political processes in the United States. This will be discussed in more detail later. Another fact pointing to the influence of the anti-cult ideological center on the U.S. is that in the 1990s, American newspapers, including prestigious outlets like the New York Times, suddenly began actively quoting Alexander Dvorkin and his subjective assessments of so-called cults, not only in Russia, but in other countries as well. Doesn't it seem odd that the comments of a Russian cult expert suddenly appear in such well-known newspapers as the New York Times? It's noteworthy that the views and comments of a relatively unknown Russian cult expert were featured in the New York Times. Despite the usual difficulty of achieving such exposure, even for top-level experts. This could be the result of financial investments, or bribery of the media, or even the presence of certain influence agents within the media. Regardless, this indicates the existence of a coordinated force to integrate the opinions of Russian extremist anti-cultists into American publications. Now, using the activities of the umbrella organizations FECRIS and Ratseers and their leaders as examples, let's examine the criminal methods of their operation, which might qualify the activities of anti-cult organizations as terrorist acts. How do anti-cult organizations operate, and what is their role in executing the enemy's global plan to destroy democracy?
In the flood of news, many of you have come across terms like destructive cults, totalitarian sects, or even killer cults.
Dangerous and abusive cult.
Totalitarian cults.
Cults. The word cult.
The cult. Cult.
Shocking cults.
Representatives of anti-cult organizations label selected groups without relying on factual evidence, police investigations, or thorough complex theological analysis. Instead, they follow entirely different playbooks, which have no relation to theoretical science or even to objective reality.
While the term cult is a key stigmatizing term in the United States, in Europe and the post-Soviet countries, this role is played by the term sect, especially totalitarian sect, which also carries a strong derogatory and stigmatizing connotation. Since 1993, anti-cult movement ideologue Alexander Dvorkin has widely introduced the term totalitarian sect into post-Soviet media. The term totalitarian, borrowed from political science and propaganda language of the Cold War era, evokes associations with oppression, camps, imprisonment, barbed wire, forced labor, and meager food. Thus, this term is used to incite fear, anxiety, and a biased attitude toward the members of organizations labeled as totalitarian sects. The vagueness of the terms totalitarian sect and destructive cult allows anti-cultists to baselessly categorize any organization under these labels.
However, the use of terms such as sect, cult, totalitarian sect, and destructive cult is not supported by the laws of most countries or international legal documents. These terms lack legal justification, and their use contradicts the legislation on freedom of conscience and religious associations. Nonetheless, anti-cultists continue to use these terms as weapons of accusation and incite the media to use them.
The illegal activities of the anti-cult movement do not go unnoticed both internationally and within Russia, where representatives of academic and legal circles highlight the fraudulent and criminal nature of anti-cult organizations in general, and their chief ideologue, Alexander Dvorkin, in particular. Alexander Dvorkin's activities are also condemned in the United States, where a legal assessment of him was provided in a special report for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, USCIRF. The main responsibilities of this commission include reviewing the facts and circumstances of universal religious freedom violations and making policy recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and Congress. Here are some findings and recommendations provided by Jason Morton, a policy analyst for the USCIRF, in a report titled The Anti-Cult Movement and Religious Regulation in Russia and the Former Soviet Union. Dvorkin has long provided the anti-cult movement with a veneer of intellectual credibility. Alexander Dvorkin and his associates have carved out influential roles in government and society, shaping the public discourse on religion across numerous countries. Claiming to be experts in academic fields like religious studies, psychology, and sociology, they are rarely qualified in any of them, and often rely on discredited theories and methodologies to promote their ideological agenda. The anti-cult movement is fundamentally a propaganda outlet, conducting a highly effective information war against religious minorities throughout Russia and many of the countries in which it retains influence. The U.S. government should publicly censure Alexander Dvorkin and the St. Irenaeus of Leon Information Consultation Center, SILIC, for their ongoing disinformation campaign against religious minorities. Counter propaganda against new religious movements by the European Federation of Research and Information Centers on Sectarianism, FECRIS, at the annual OSCE Human Dimensions Conference, with information about the ongoing involvement of individuals and entities within the anti-cult movement in the suppression of religious freedom.
Thus, representatives of the anti-cult movement do not hold a scientific position or have research motives, although they often disguise themselves as such. In reality, they intentionally introduce the concepts of destructive cults and totalitarian sects into the information space, using them to incite hatred and religious intolerance in society. The criteria and accusations they use to classify certain organizations as cults and sects are not recognized both in academic circles and within the legal framework. Attaching a harshly negative label is the first step in a systematic scheme of conducting information terrorist attacks. The goal is to transform followers of peaceful organizations and law-abiding citizens into objects of hatred and hostility without any factual basis.
Dehumanization. The process of dehumanization is the first step in the actions of anti-cult organizations aimed at eliminating those they find undesirable. This method is used to push the victim out of the social field, making them highly vulnerable. After all, if a group of people or an individual is labeled a cultist or cult member, the victim immediately loses his or her human image. This stigmatization creates the conditions for further violations of human rights and freedoms. Dehumanization serves to justify future crimes, dull the conscience and critical perception among the population. Dehumanization is the processing of society to accept and participate in future crimes. Presently, anti-cult terrorists have managed to implant the following mindset in the masses: cultist equals non-human. To achieve their goals, representatives of anti-cult organizations utilize the media, propaganda, the dominant religion in their country, law enforcement agencies, and even governmental structures.
Totalitarian sects are dangerous. They pose a significant social threat.
When most people use the word cult to define a group, they mean a destructive cult. Cults that hurt people through abuse. This could be physical, mental, emotional, sexual, or financial exploitation. Often deceptive, coercive, abusive, and relentlessly authoritarian.
a myriad of different types of mind control cults. There are religious cults and therapy cults and business cults and political cults, cults of personality with
Any cultic structure always fights against society, demonizing and speaking negatively about it, which is natural. And studying the history of any given cult organization, we understand the serious threat they pose on a personal level, at the family level, societal level, and even at the national security level. The goal of any cult is power and money.
Each totalitarian sect that is a cult has global plans. Each totalitarian sect strives for power and control over the world and over everyone. That's what makes them cults. They may temporarily cooperate with each other as long as they have a common enemy. And this common enemy for them is primarily orthodoxy.
Right now, while you were listening, some of you might have had thoughts in the background like, what's wrong with what the anti-cultists are saying? Cults are indeed dangerous. And all cult members are brainwashed, foolish, or deceived people. You might be surprised when I tell you that these thoughts are not your own personal convictions. These thoughts are actually the result of the anti-cultists' efforts to artificially implant these destructive images into your subconscious through the information field. Many of you, when hearing the words cult or sect, recall real examples of dangerous cults you have heard about in the media, whose activities have caused harm to people and society. The term cult is associated with personal danger, images of mass suicides, women who have been victims of sexual exploitation, the erratic behavior of cult leaders bordering on psychopathy, and zombified followers who unquestioningly give all their money and property to their leader. However, think about how long ago did you meet such things in real life, and what is your knowledge of new religious movements, aside from the negative images spread by anti-cultists? Of course, it must be acknowledged that among the founders of new religious movements, there are individuals engaged in fraud and deliberately exploiting the trust of citizens for personal gain, including committing illegal acts and crimes. But how can representatives of anti-cult organizations help in this situation? These cases should be handled by law enforcement agencies, since they bear the main responsibility for protecting citizens from such threats. In such cases, they must conduct the necessary investigation, collect evidence of illegal activity, and only after that should all perpetrators be prosecuted according to the law and the criminal organization be terminated. However, when it comes to anti-cultists, everything happens in reverse order. First, they make baseless accusations and attach labels comparable to accusations of committing grave crimes, and only then do they seek the involvement of law enforcement agencies and the initiation of criminal cases. However, the majority of such cases are based not on facts or results of objective investigation, but on rumors, slander, false testimonies, and labels affixed by anti-cultists. This particular characteristic of the strategy employed by all anti-cult organizations reveals their actual goals and intentions. They do not aim for an objective analysis of religious organizations to identify potentially dangerous ones. Instead, they are focused on discrediting and shutting down any groups they choose as targets. They achieve this by violating basic rights and freedoms, employing a range of manipulative methods, smear rhetoric, and hate speech. Because their true goal is not the stigmatized groups they've discredited and persecuted, but the entire society that will be watching this public execution. Their goal is to carry out acts of information terrorism aimed at undermining society, destabilizing the situation in the country, and ultimately destroying democracy.
One of the tactics used by anti-cultists is to justify the unwarranted persecution of modern religious organizations by citing historical examples where certain extremist groups, labeled as cults, committed real crimes. From these isolated cases, a false conclusion is drawn about the danger of all new religious movements without exception, regardless of their origin, goals, or values. The method of guilt by association is a manipulative tactic where the targeted organization is intentionally linked or associated with negative images of extremist groups, terrorist organizations, criminals, and dictators who are already viewed negatively by the public. This tactic is further amplified by a deliberate distortion of fragments of the target organization's teachings, taken out of context, which contributes to the demonization of the group's image. As a result, an aura of danger is deliberately created around the undesirable organizations and their members, accusing them of crimes despite the lack of direct evidence of any harmful activities. Such actions by representatives of anti-cult organizations denote a complete violation of the presumption of innocence, as proclaimed by Article 11 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that every person has the inherent right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty according to law. Violating the presumption of innocence is an illegal act aimed at spreading intentional slander and misleading the public. Mass media are accomplices of anti-cult terrorists. Mass media play a crucial role in dehumanization and targeted persecution of religious and secular organizations chosen by anticultists as their victims. By leveraging their unofficial contacts among media representatives, including journalists, editors, and leaders of major publications, anticultists initiate and carry out large-scale and prolonged campaigns to discredit these targeted organizations. In essence, they orchestrate information terrorism.
Therefore, the cult works ahead of the curve.
How do cultist fraudsters turn people into slaves? And how have they managed to evade responsibility for decades? How Jehovah's Witnesses embarked on the path of extremism.
As part of these campaigns, various methods of negative influence are employed, including the use of aggressive rhetoric, hate speech, dissemination of false information, slander, provocations, and incitement to aggression against targeted individuals. In this process, unscrupulous media representatives are recruited into this network of cooperation, willing to engage in dubious actions to achieve their goals, meaning committing information terrorism. Thus, anti-cult organization representatives recruit the direct perpetrators of future attacks. Additionally, anti-cultists create the image of victims from some of the recruited or interested individuals who have allegedly suffered from the malevolent influence of the stigmatized organization. The stories of these pseudo-victims are widely disseminated in defamatory media publications, despite many of these tales being intentional lies.
All this inevitably leads to crime, which in fact exists in the vast majority of cults, or potentially exists in one way or another. Violations of the law begin. At first a few, then more, and then it's more often, and these are obvious crimes, and they absolutely violate all moral norms.
This is how anti-cultists label a targeted group as dangerous and manipulative, though in reality, it is their own actions that are dangerous and manipulative. Through their people in the media, they conduct genuine psychological processing of society. This, in turn, allows them to manipulate the aggressive sentiments of the public, the sentiments that they themselves have provoked. They implant explicit narratives in people's subconscious that all the organizations they label are cults and are dangerous, and that cult members are non-humans. This simple formula plays on the basic instincts of every person, evoking fear for their own lives and the lives of their children, creating an image of a constantly looming threat. Naturally, the reaction to this stimulus is self-defense, with only two options: fight or flight. Since anti-cultists accompany their propaganda with incitement to hatred and encouragement of unlawful acts, the dominant response becomes fight or even destroy. Under this scheme, anti-cultists can dehumanize and demonize any organization they consider undesirable, pushing it outside the bounds of the social field. When you hear the word dehumanization, it might seem abstract to you. If so, I invite you to listen to the stories of the outcomes of its practice on the specific example.
Alexander Dvorkin's anti-cult terrorist activities. For many years, Ratsir's representatives have been spreading hostile statements towards numerous new religious movements. Their meetings, interviews, lectures, and public activities have created a hostile atmosphere in society, often leading to subsequent manifestations of hatred and xenophobia among the population. For instance, the ringleader of the anti-cult group in Russia, radical ideologist Alexander Dvorkin, has waged an active disinformation campaign against the Christian movement of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia since the beginning of his anti-cult career in 1993. Dvorkin used all forms of propaganda against the followers of this organization, from defamatory articles in newspapers, magazines, and internet portals, to media appearances where he gave highly negative assessments of this religious group, accusing and portraying their activities in the worst possible light.
The Jehovah's Witnesses came to an Orthodox Christian country. They insult me and my faith, and in this sense, I have the right to respond to them. My book is a response to their persistent molestation and their relentless recruitment. These Jehovah's Witnesses manipulate the minds of their members, but they also make enormous amounts of money. Usually, when Jehovah's Witnesses speak, they certainly squeeze out everything they can. Jehovah's Witnesses, by definition, cannot be called Christians, no matter what they call themselves, because they do not consider Christ to be God. Jehovah's Witnesses are undoubtedly a totalitarian sect, because Jehovah's Witnesses are a commercial cult.
For instance, in mid-2009, Dvorkin gave an interview to the federal Russian channel NTV, where among other harsh statements, he compared Jehovah's Witnesses to drug dealers and called them slaves.
In fact, what they give for free is similar to how a drug dealer in an alley gives the first shot for free. And he might even give the second shot for free. But to get the third shot, people run to him and bring money. This is done by people for free, who live in Bethels and work irregular hours in exchange for a bed in a dormitory and meals in a common dining hall. Food comes from Jehovah's Witnesses farms. Similar slaves produce the food there. In other words, the expenses are minimal.
This interview, which was clearly propagandistic, contributed to a surge of hatred and aggression against Jehovah's Witnesses and caused a drastic increase in religiously motivated crimes in Russia, including attacks on prayer houses and private homes of believers, as well as threats and brutal physical violence. Here's a far from complete list of acts of violence against Jehovah's Witnesses, committed by Russian citizens in 2009-2010 following Dvorkin's speeches. An attack was carried out on the home of an elderly Jehovah's Witness couple, with their windows being shattered by stones. A schoolboy whose parents are Jehovah's Witnesses was attacked. 2 female Jehovah's Witnesses were assaulted, with one being struck on the head and losing consciousness. 2 female Jehovah's Witnesses were brutally insulted and severely beaten. 2 female Jehovah's Witnesses were attacked, one being pushed down a flight of stairs and the other kicked in the back. An attack on a Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses resulted in the beating of the security guards and the building being set on fire.
The Jehovah's Witnesses cult doesn't hold up because of their ridiculous, absurd, self-contradictory faith. It holds up through the strict control of the cult. It's a very strict totalitarian sect and cult. Pedophilia. There are actually hundreds of cases of pedophilia, and the cult has covered them up every time.
Cults, 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 cults.
Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult.
Hands off our children. Belgorod is a cult-free territory.
And this is just a small part of the consequences of merely 1 year of public activity by just one representative of the anti-cult movement in one country. Dvorkin's public, extremist, and baseless statements led to a series of attacks and acts of violence against Jehovah's Witnesses and other religious groups in various regions of Russia in 2009-2010. Numerous cases have also been recorded where large families of Jehovah's Witnesses were harmed in various ways, had their property damaged, and had their homes burned to the ground. All of this was done by individuals influenced by Dvorkin's manipulative speeches, which carry a hidden message of denying human rights of stigmatized groups of people and turning them into public targets.
That's right. Persecuted. You must be persecuted. Because it's just a nightmare. It's a cult.
Why put people in prison? You have your truth. We have our truth. But there are more of us than you. If they cross the red line, not only the line,
red line?
In the past,
Well,
these
religion.
were stoned to death.
Again, raising the issue of destructiveness, totalitarian sects may be compared to a circle of scorched earth that constantly expands, leaving only scorched earth and ruins inside. Such spiritual casualties, crippled individuals, remain outside. They are cast out and then thrown back into society, for society itself to somehow rehabilitate them and deal with their problems.
Let's consider an example of using a manipulative method aimed at forming an image of the enemy and dehumanizing certain groups of people. Please note that in his public speeches, Alexander Dvorkin regularly repeats the following stigmatizing comparison.
Another name for totalitarian sects is destructive cults. Destructive meaning ruinous, like cancerous cells that enter the body and spread metastases throughout the organism until the body dies. Cults behave in society like a cancerous tumor in one's body, draining nutrients from society and feeding off it until the body itself dies. Just as a cancerous tumor destroys the body, a cult similarly destroys society from within.
Dvorkin's use of such metaphors as scorched earth and cancerous tumor in relation to people who are labeled sectarians or cultists is not accidental. Dvorkin deliberately voices these vivid negative figurative comparisons in order to bypass your critical thinking and dehumanize representatives of those communities in your eyes, intentionally associating them with something extremely dangerous and harmful, something that requires immediate elimination. Such a comparison activates the mechanisms of black and white thinking in your mind when an object that a manipulative narrative is focused on is regarded as an absolute evil requiring unconditional rejection. At the same time, Dvorkin himself is perfectly aware that his radical rhetoric is a blatant violation of human rights and a manifestation of extremism. So, in order to avoid direct accusations of inciting aggression towards people, from lecture to lecture he plays safe by voicing another manipulative statement. We don't fight cultists, we fight cults.
We are often asked a standard journalistic question. Tell us, how do you fight cultists? And I always have the same answer to that. I don't fight cultists, I fight cults.
The phrase "we fight cults" and not cultists, often used by Dvorkin and his followers, is a prime example of semantic manipulation. This statement contains a dichotomy that creates an illusion of differentiation between the concept of a cult as an organization and the real people who are its members. However, in reality, such a differentiation is impossible since any organization consists of people and cannot exist without them. Dvorkin's manipulative statement ignores the fact that the activities of the organizations he called cults and the personalities of the so-called cultists are inextricably linked. This means that he calls people cancerous tumors and scorched earth, thereby causing public hatred towards them. To make the essence of this manipulation clearer to you, please answer the following question. When you heard this comparative metaphor that cults are cancerous tumors, what image appeared in your mind? Some kind of abstract image of a cult? Or did you see an image of specific personalities whom you associate with the word cult, whom you yourself know or saw in the media? Your consciousness actually displayed an image of people because the image and mental command that Dvorkin instilled through such verbal manipulations consists in the following message: cultists are dangerous. They must be exterminated. Such manipulative techniques used by representatives of the anti-cult clique provoke cognitive dissonance in your mind, forcing you to accept negative images without critical assessment of those. This provocation of cognitive dissonance is a form of mental violence, inasmuch as it undermines independence of a person's thinking, forcibly instills hatred in him towards his fellow citizens, and gives him a direct instruction for violent actions. Please note that Anticultists use this technique of covert cultivation of hatred to your detriment in many spheres of life, when they need to make you hate those people whom they target, when they need to set one part of society against another, causing a wave of hatred and violence within society.
Manipulative methods used by Alexander Dvorkin constitute illegal actions that have already caused severe psychological, moral, and physical suffering among the population and have led to many deaths, details of which will be discussed later. Dvorkin's public statements bear clear signs of incitement to hatred and meet all the criteria of the threshold test established under the Rabat Plan of Action. According to widely recognized international legal norms, such activities should be prohibited by law, and all individuals involved in their execution should be held accountable in accordance with the law.
Interestingly, Alexander Dvorkin, the leader of anti-cult organizations and the author of the term totalitarian sect, opposes the introduction of a legal definition for cult. This is because it would then be necessary to prove, based on facts, that an organization is indeed a totalitarian sect or destructive cult, and that the accusations against it have a factual basis. As the leader of the anti-cult movement in Russia himself stated, most of these cases would be lost.
22 years ago, I started dealing with cults. I used to say that we urgently needed to introduce a legal term cult to address this issue. However, soon I realized that it is absolutely impossible to do it now, in the current situation. Because if we were to introduce the legal term cult tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, courts would be flooded with lawsuits from those very cults that would be saying, prove that we are a cult, and present all the evidence to support such a definition. Prove that we comply with this definition. Thus, a large portion of lawsuits would likely be lost. Then, by court decision, we would no longer be able to call various organizations cults, even the most sinister and disgusting ones.
Definition of the terms sect and cult in the law would automatically restrict their unjustified use, which in turn would deprive anticultists of their main tool that represents a starting point for subsequent illegal actions.
Now, we at least don't have such a legal term, therefore we can call cults cults. And I personally withstood 5 legal proceedings. In fact, any person can call an organization cult with no fear of punishment if he considers it to be a cult, and there is nothing that can be done. This is what I'm expressing. It's a religious science term, it's a theological term. I'm expressing my opinion, and they won't be able to do anything about it.
It is worth remembering that using the term sect or cult in an accusatory or demonizing way is a direct violation of the constitutional rights of citizens in a democratic society, in particular, freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. Through such actions, anticultists, who decided that they are entitled to pass such a sentence on any individual or group of people, basically seek to supersede law enforcement agencies and the law.
At a time when anti-cult terrorists carry out their destructive activities in various countries, introducing the mindsets they need among masses of people, the number of hate crimes against religions and beliefs is growing proportionally. A huge number of people across the world who became targets of purposeful persecution have been facing abuse, physical violence, and forced isolation for many years and decades. They experience mental violence, moral oppression, fear, and humiliation.
When someone tries to label you as a cultist, it's extremely dangerous. Essentially, such a label in society marks you as a target that can and should be destroyed. This is similar to how the Nazis once forced Jews to wear yellow stars. This mark created a chasm between Jews and the rest of the population, highlighting their difference. marking them as others and non-humans, and making them easy targets for aggression on the part of people influenced by propaganda. The yellow star signaled that its wearers could be treated as less than human. Using the yellow star was one of many ways the Nazis dehumanized Jews and prepared the ground for their mass extermination. Ultimately, this labeling led to one of the most tragic chapters in human history, the Holocaust. Today, Anticultists use the same methods, assigning labels like cult and sect to various organizations, thereby separating them from society and stripping them of their status as people. These labels take away their democratic rights and freedoms, telling society that these people are different and that they can be deprived of their rights, treated without respect, and even with violence. During the Nazi era, the harsh treatment of Jews was the result of well-organized propaganda. The media of that time were tools for creating the image of the enemy, despite the lack of facts and evidence. Similarly, today, innocent people labeled as cult or sect members by anticultists become victims of accusations for crimes they did not commit.
Because a cultist, a member of a totalitarian sect, if required to lie, steal, kill, and so on, he simply doesn't think twice but follows the order. Because he would act, for the benefit of the whole world, for the salvation of humanity and so on. What does some insignificant human life matter that gets in the way of this? Undoubtedly, for this, any means are justified.
But that's more of a fanatic than a cultist.
Any cultist is actually a fanatic by definition.
You use the term war, saying we need a war. I mean, these are different kinds of people. Doesn't it bother you? This is just an emotional question.
Well, it's a fight. It's a war. Call it what you wish, but it really
It doesn't bother me.
It's a war against inhuman organizations that enslave people and deprive them of freedom.
Stigmatizing certain groups and communities by defining them as cult, totalitarian sect, or destructive cult shapes public perception of them as highly negative and dangerous entities. This leads to the marginalization of these communities as social groups and their discrimination within society. They are met with suspicion, insulted, humiliated, and ridiculed. People refuse to hire them, collaborate with them, or engage in personal relationships with them. The problems these individuals face are numerous, from public condemnation, conflicts, and threats to physical violence, criminal prosecution, searches, and more. Stigmatized individuals become targets. They are hated, despised, and avoided. They are met with anger and disgust. They can face anything, from disdainful avoidance to violence, including murder. And this happens solely because anti-cultists chose them as targets. Constant demonization and hate speech undoubtedly have a severe negative impact on the physical and psychological health of the victim. This topic has been extensively researched by psychologists and psychiatrists. A report published by the American Psychological Association compares the symptoms observed in victims of hate crimes to those of post-traumatic stress disorder. A study conducted in the United States in 2001 showed that victims of hate crimes experience more severe consequences than victims of other types of crimes. Victims of prejudice, members of stigmatized groups, often experience depression, which may include sadness, fatigue, anhedonia, hopelessness, social withdrawal, or even catatonia. Victims of prejudice also experience stigma, a state of personal shame and devaluation, which is a crucial component of depression. They experience an increased number of suicidal thoughts and other mental health issues. For victims of prejudice, suicide offers an escape from the hatred they face, driven by despair and a desire to flee. Suicidal victims of prejudice do not wish to harm themselves. They simply want to avoid the harm inflicted upon them by others. A classic example of creators of stereotypes and enforcers of prejudices are the Nazis.
Branded and socially isolated, the victims of anticultists feel much like the victims of the Holocaust once did. The fact is, the targets of anticultist terrorism, whether an organization or an individual subjected to persecution and attacks, feel doomed and eventually come to terms with their situation. This is comparable to how Holocaust victims resign themselves to their fate, knowing they were inevitably facing execution or the gas chamber. The hopelessness and fear of the inevitable traumatize a person on a subconscious level. Even though the conscious mind tries to suppress and push away this fear, the subconscious trauma remains deeply rooted. Imagine what these people experience and how their lives unfold after enduring such trauma. So, the labels of sect or cult used by anticultists are not just words. They are tools that lead to the destruction of the foundations of humanity. The history of Nazism's impact on the world teaches us that when society starts to divide people into us and them, it leads to irreparable consequences.
One of your statements. Orthodox Christians are no better than everyone else. If they were, the whole world would have become Orthodox a long time ago. Maybe we are even worse than everyone else. But Orthodoxy is definitely the only direct path to God. What gives you the right to state that? And I think it's a statement, first of all. Secondly, isn't this inciting, at any rate to some degree, of interreligious hostility or intolerance?
Well, no, not at all. Because first of all, every religion considers itself true while all others are mistaken. A member of any religion can say this. The path of Indian asceticism is only to attain eternal death, to attain eternal non-being. And in this, of course, lies the demonic nature of Hinduism. When you see two women in the street brainwashing a mother with a stroller, you can approach her and say, don't listen to them. They are cultists, Jehovah's Witnesses. They grossly distort the Holy Scripture.
Isn't this inciting, at any rate to some degree, of interreligious hostility or intolerance?
Well, no, not at all. Muhammad, although he belonged to that powerful tribe, he was from its poor branch. So he was a rather poor man. He got a job with his distant relative, the twice-widowed Khadijah, and started leading her caravans, gaining her trust. And when he was 25 years old, Khadijah, who was then over 40, married for the third time her pretty-faced clerk. Inciting interreligious hostility is if I insult specific bearers of one or another particular religious idea. The principle of Orthodox Christian relations with other religions is respect for every person. Long before he arrived, all of Moscow was covered with posters of this man with a horse-like face, and it was inscribed that the great Tony Robbins had arrived, and everyone was wondering what this was all about. Then Muhammad had some strange visions and revelations. Some people believe he had epileptic seizures. Tom Cruise is the Goebbels of Scientology, the minister of propaganda. Thorov himself is a very gray and dark man. He speaks very boringly. He is sort of like a very dull, gray person, and respect for every person. Who do we know? What cultists do we know? Street beggars? Annoying recruiters who knock on our doors? Cults are dangerous at the societal level because, unlike traditional denominations that enrich society and create culture, cults give nothing to society. We don't know cultists who are respect for every person. Writers, artists, music composers, philosophers, and so on, they only drain society of its vital resources, just like a cancerous tumor pulls the vital resources from the body until it eventually destroys it.
The cancerous tumor pulls the vital resources from the body until it eventually destroys it.
We can discuss each of the cults, many of them, talking about how exactly these totalitarian schemes are embodied in their teachings. The International Society for Krishna Consciousness, or the Hare Krishnas. This cult had a lot they would like to conceal. There was drug trafficking, arms trade, and murders. Overall, it is quite obvious that the International Society for Krishna Consciousness is a ruthless group aiming to seize power. It is built on strict totalitarian principles and dreams of spreading those principles to the entire global population. It seems clear that this is one of the attempts of the impending Antichrist. It is obvious. Perhaps the International Society for Krishna Consciousness is one of the actual forerunners of the Antichrist, who ultimately seeks to seize power worldwide. Possibly, it is through these very methods that his advent is being prepared. There can be no equality between Orthodox Christianity, which has existed in Russia for 1,000 years, and a tiny marginal cult like the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which appeared here just a couple of decades ago, but loudly demands to be recognized on a par with orthodoxy and given preferential treatment.
There was an attack on the temple of the Moscow Society.
In Barnaul, there was an attempted attack on Krishna worshippers.
Krishna worshippers were beaten in Moscow.
Krishna devotee was beaten.
Scientology is one of the most dangerous totalitarian sects, and Scientology surpasses many cults in its destructiveness. I've seen many ex-Scientologists who were absolutely just severely mentally ill. I'll repeat again, cults are very aggressive and very deceitful. With the mentality of a slave and the mentality of a whistleblower. He works for intelligence services. He's been gathering information since he was a child. I mean, he brings money, he brings information. If you're in Scientology, when you finally run out of everything, when you run out of money and your mental health or physical health, they will get rid of you. They will throw you out on the street and forget about you.
FSB released video of searches at Scientology centers.
Searches in Moscow in connection with the case of Scientology.
Court sentenced 5 Scientologists.
White Scientologists are Scientology organizations have been declared undesirable.
Among neo-Pentecostals, there is a tithe, but again, no one counts it. Yet, there is such an ordinary elementary principle of extortion. It's an alternative version of Christianity created by the enemy of the human race, which is called Christianity, and from which the entire essence of Christianity has been hollowed out. Neo-Pentecostals are 300,000 plus activists who will go where they are told and do what they are ordered to do. This is not a figure of speech.
On the Pentecostal
Oman
church
attacked
in
Pentecostals. Searches conducted at the homes of leaders of the new generation.
Residents disrupted a Pentecostal worship service.
Charge. Thus, public activities of the ringleader of the Russian anti-cult clique, Alexander Dvorkin, exhibit signs of crimes associated with terrorist activities. Hostile statements that create an atmosphere of intolerance, resulting in verbal abuse, threats, and physical attacks on people, as well as attacks on buildings, including arson. This is incitement to commit terrorist acts that spread hatred and endanger lives. It also hinders the enjoyment of human rights, including the right to life, liberty, and security. Therefore, according to the definition in the UN General Assembly resolution adopted on June 22, 2023, this activity constitutes terrorism.
An aggravating circumstance is Dvorkin's deliberate use of special hidden manipulative methods and technologies aimed at covert influence, programming, and control of human behavior. Their use is directly evidenced by the fact that his public activities provoked a wave of violence among the population towards stigmatized victims, including physical violence against them, up to murders. These manipulative technologies operate bypassing critical perception through consciousness and directly affecting a person's deep subconsciousness. It is exactly the destructive mindsets and commands implanted into people's subconsciousness without their knowledge that force people to subsequently commit acts of violence and hatred against targeted individuals, chosen not by themselves, but by Dvorkin. He has artificially incited a wave of hatred and negativity in people and forced them to act. In a literal sense, Dvorkin has directed those individuals, like torpedoes, against their will and desire towards his chosen targets. Therefore, all those individuals who committed acts of aggression against other people who are just like them, but marked by anti-cultists with a yellow star, are also victims of informational terror attacks. Dvorkin had programmed them for those actions in advance at the level of subconsciousness. When he used manipulative technologies in his speeches, they were literally forced to act this way, and unknowingly, by attacking innocent people, They were enacting someone else's malicious will. This is why Dvorkin's speeches had such a powerful effect on people, although in the overwhelming majority of cases, evidence for his accusatory speeches was not presented. The mere utterance of these labels was enough to provoke an explosive reaction in society and a wave of brutality against the labeled groups.
The use of these hidden manipulative technologies within the anti-cult movement was first introduced by Alexander Dvorkin. This has since become a common practice for creating informational terror attacks by all anti-cult organizations, including Ratsirs and Fekris. These very methods enable anti-cults to influence people against their will. Moreover, it doesn't matter if this happens directly through personal contact or remotely through media messages. The power of influence remains unchanged. More details about the technology itself, as well as about the source where Dvorkin received it from, will be provided a little later.
Representatives of anti-cult organizations use foul techniques of manipulative psychological influence on the masses to carry out real acts of terrorism. Until recently, it was believed that informational and psychological terror attacks were not as frightening as physical ones because they supposedly did not kill anyone directly like a bomb explosion would. But in reality, informational terror attacks are much more dangerous and destructive, most of all because they are conducted covertly, operating at the subconscious level, easily penetrating the critical thinking barrier of the conscious mind and infecting people with destructive beliefs, thereby creating new terrorists. The impact radius of such attacks is much larger than physical ones because by acting through the informational space, they are not limited by space or time. The most terrifying aspect of this situation is that for a very long time, up to today, a vast number of real terrorists have remained unpunished. However, while their methods of influencing the depths of the subconscious can go unnoticed by the masses, the demonization and groundless accusations of groups of people stigmatized by representatives of anti-cult organizations and systematic violation of the presumption of innocence are always in full sight. Even by this one factor alone, they can now be easily identified and held accountable to the fullest extent of the law for their complicity in and perpetration of terrorism.
Anticultists' influence on law enforcement agencies.
Public activities of anticultists are merely a preparatory stage for further involving law enforcement and security forces in suppressing religious groups. For this purpose, under the guise of educational work, members of anti-cult organizations deliver lectures and arrange consultations for law enforcement agencies, including police academies and security management, where they continue to propagate the same messages that cult members are a threat to society.
Anticultist Alexander Dvorkin gave a lesson to students in Chelyabinsk.
Cults lure people in through deception, withholding information, and dishonest advertising. Cults are dangerous to individuals because they enslave personality and turn a human into an obedient tool in the hands of cult leaders.
Such activities are not only unacceptable, but also dangerous, as they aim to instill radical ideology in the minds of security officials, which can have far-reaching consequences for society and the state as a whole.
Several eyewitness stories will help illustrate the seriousness of the problem and serve as examples of what terrorist anti-cult propaganda is capable of in the modern, civilized 21st century. First-person account from Andrei in Belgorod. Requested anonymity.
There were actions taken against us. For example, in the fall of 2012, we held a Congress. The area was cordoned off by Cossacks with whips. They beat drums, invited the NTV television company and local media, and portrayed our activities in a negative light. They shouted at us, "We'll throw a grenade at you," and the police did not react at all. At some of the actions against Jehovah's Witnesses, they wore T-shirts that said, "I hate Jehovah's Witnesses." I was directly threatened. "Aren't you afraid you'll get hit on the head and be disabled for life?" Given what I've witnessed since around 2010, I believe it will only worsen.
My dear ones, please, if you carry your faith, carry it with peace and kindness. We've never stabbed anyone, and we're not going to stab anyone.
In 2014, an elderly fellow believer was killed in Stary Oskol. She was on her way to a meeting, got into an elevator, and was found with multiple stab wounds, and her eyes gouged out. The local media wrote that she was a member of one of the cults, which is how they often refer to us. The perpetrators were never found. Our sister was beaten in her own apartment building by a man who then dragged her around the building. Funeral wreaths with inscriptions to victims of the Watchtower were placed at our Kingdom Hall in Belgorod, and swastikas were painted on the building's walls. I believe that the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses is orchestrated by the FSB. In their view, Jehovah's Witnesses do not fit into the political framework of today's Russia. The 5th Directorate of the KGB used to persecute dissenters. Today, it is the Directorate for the Protection of the Constitutional Order of the FSB. This is the political police. Jehovah's Witnesses refuse military service and do not support any political forces, which does not align with the ideology of modern Russia. I think the Russian Orthodox Church, ROC, plays the role assigned to it by the FSB. If we look at the history of the ROC as it exists today, it was created by Stalin's order in 1943. Since then, this religious organization has been a structural subdivision of the State Security Committee, which is now the FSB of Russia. Experienced police officers have told me that they don't understand why they are being forced to persecute people for their religion. One even said that under the current government, it has become embarrassing to work in the police force because they are detaining elderly women for talking about the Bible, apprehending people on the street for unclear reasons, breaking into apartments, and so on. What is happening to Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia today can happen to anyone, to any political or religious movement, such as Baptists, Pentecostals, or the autonomous Russian Orthodox Church. They are already under pressure and are at risk. The broad definitions of anti-extremist laws allow for the persecution of anyone. We know that people can be imprisoned for reposting something on the internet or for making a simple statement deemed extremist, using the law to force this into the so-called legal framework.
In 2017, due to lobbying by Dvorkin and members of his group, Jehovah's Witnesses were declared an extremist organization, and their activities were banned in Russia. From that moment, the repression against them intensified and continues to this day. Members of this religious organization face arrests, searches, and prosecutions, as well as cruel treatment and even torture. Some of them, including elderly people and retirees, have been sentenced to long terms in penal colonies and imprisonment for their beliefs and religious activities.
The editorial collegium of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation has determined the decision of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation dated April 20th, 2017 remains unchanged, and the appellate complaint of the religious organization Administrative Center of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia is dismissed.
Freedom of conscience in Russia has been crucified. There is no doubt that what happened to Jehovah's Witnesses will affect other denominations as well. A little bit later, religious persecutions will begin in Russia. There will be prisoners of conscience. The very term cult is certainly used as a stigma, as a label intended to turn people away from Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as from other organizations that are also labeled as cults by anti-cult activists or other opponents. If we assess the contribution of the anti-cult movement to the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses, I believe it plays an overwhelmingly negative role and largely contributes to the expansion of persecutions against peaceful believers who simply seek to satisfy their religious needs, guaranteed by the Constitution of the Russian Federation. The right to satisfy their religious needs, including the right to collectively profess their religion. Believers are already facing persecution, attacks, and physical violence in places where meetings and gatherings used to take place. They are subjected to acts of vandalism. We fear that this will become widespread. People who are guilty of nothing other than adhering to certain religious beliefs will find themselves targeted by those who consider them enemies of society.
As for liquidation of the Jehovah's Witnesses organization, in this regard, I have no disagreement with it. The ban on the organization is undoubtedly helpful. Primarily, we no longer see Jehovah's Witnesses in the streets, and consequently, people are protected from their intrusive propaganda and recruitment. When we talk about Jehovah's Witnesses, I certainly hope that their ordinary members will at least receive administrative penalties, but I understand that I'm not a lawyer and the law is the law.
They poured water on my hands and started hitting them with a taser. At that moment, it was the most painful sensation. I was electrocuted, just like other people were. They hit me on the head, they hit me in the ribs, on the right side of my body. They put a blue plastic bag over my head, tightened it, and I began to suffocate. At the moment when I began to suffocate, they put a hand over my mouth and put a taser on my buttocks in the crotch area. I think, apparently, it was a taser, and they started an electric current. When I was interrogated, apparently someone was brought into the adjacent room again, so I heard everything clearly. There were electric shocks and screams. Some names, surnames, and addresses. I said I would only cooperate with the investigator in the presence of my lawyer. Then they put a hat on my face and took me out into the woods behind the stadium.
This is what the consequences of dehumanization lead to. All these people are just like you. The only difference is how and what they believe in. They harm no one and infringe on no one's rights. All they do is express their views on the world and life differently. For this alone, they are publicly stripped of their humanity, slandered, and targeted by society, law enforcement, and security agencies. Even some law enforcement officers bound to follow orders understand this is absurd. They are ashamed to carry out these orders but cannot disobey. As a result, ordinary people branded by anti-cultists, along with their families, children, and loved ones, suffer immense hardships.
I'm now talking about citizens. Surely they are being taken care of by banning this cult, first and foremost, right? But we'll discuss that further. At this very moment, when they exist somewhere out there, we see them only on the internet, appearing in some news stories. So they...
Actually, we neither see nor hear them precisely because there is this persecution. Hence, they are now hiding, sitting quietly, and waiting to see how it will all end. Because if it weren't for that, you would see them everywhere now.
I cannot avoid quoting the words of President Putin. On December 11th, 2018, he said, "We should treat representatives of all religions equally. We should not classify representatives of religious communities as some kind of destructive, not to mention terrorist organizations." Of course, this is complete nonsense. Jehovah's Witnesses are also Christians. I don't understand why they should be persecuted. So, what do we persecute them for?
Firstly, I disagree with President Putin that Jehovah's Witnesses are Christians. They are not Christians. Christians are those who believe in divinity in Christ, while Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe in the deity of Christ. They are Jehovists. Their main god, whom they believe in, is Jehovah, so according to the rules, they should be called Jehovists.
But they don't deny Christ.
However, they don't consider him God. Muslims do not deny Christ either, but they don't consider him God. Muslims are not Christians. So this...
But Muslims are not banned, while Jehovists are...
Muslims are not, but Jehovists are banned. This is my position.
You might ask, why do law enforcement officers who are supposed to protect people uphold the law and safeguard the democratic rights of everyone, openly exhibit hatred towards innocent people, insult them, and cause severe physical harm? Because just like in the times of Nazism, the leaders of the anti-cult movement have subjected these law enforcement and security personnel to propaganda, deliberately warping their thinking, imposing the image of an enemy, and manipulating their perceptions.
The new presidential decree is changing the situation. We are not abandoning our mission of presence that has proven to be very effective in missionary work. But now, under the new strategy, we will act more openly, without fearing external persecution, which, I must admit, does happen. There are people in power structures who find our activities irritating and unacceptable. Now, Such an attitude towards us and our work will be seen as opposition to the presidential decree. I've been collaborating with law enforcement and military agencies for many years, giving lectures to their personnel about the essence of modern cultism, which is poorly understood in society. This is despite the church paying very close attention to anti-cultist activities. I've been dealing with this issue for 30 years myself. In my presentations, I have to explain a lot to cadets, law enforcement officers, and military personnel. I call the new presidential decree a real gift to us, Orthodox missionaries. In the section Expected Results of the Implementation of this strategy, it is stated that this strategy should contribute to stabilization of the social and political situation in our country, as well as to the spiritual and civic unity of the peoples of the Russian Federation, including through the activities of the Russian Orthodox Church and the broad Orthodox mission that enlightens and educates all peoples. Tuck your feet, down on the floor, down.
According to the Memorial Human Rights Center, as of April this year, at least 635 Jehovah's Witnesses have been persecuted in Russia, with no fewer than 568 people facing criminal charges.
I hoped he would leave for an hour or two. However, by evening, I realized he wouldn't return either today or probably even tomorrow.
I couldn't sleep for several nights. It was terrifying for me when evening came.
Our family's life started to divide into before and after. The feelings we experienced that evening, humiliation, moral and physical abuse, and much more.
But when militants in camouflage break in like that to old frail people, that shocks me.
Think about it. Law enforcement officers who took an oath and are obligated to protect the citizens of their country are attacking peaceful members of an unjustly branded, cornered, and discredited organization. They no longer see these individuals as citizens or even as people, but as soulless, inferior beings because anti-cultists have labeled them with a yellow star for believing in God differently. These are the Nazi methods imposed by anti-cult organizations. First, the label cult is applied by anti-cultists, and then the state assigns the status of extremism. Anticultists successfully use these methods not only in Russia, but also in Europe and worldwide. The very existence of anti-cult organizations violates one of the fundamental human freedoms, the freedom of conscience and religion. To deprive someone of the ability to believe in what they choose is to strip them of a basic need, similar to the need for food or drink. It's as if you were forbidden to eat bread because a bunch of radical extremists decided you aren't even human. And if you're not considered human, you can't behave like one. This means you don't deserve humane treatment and cannot have human rights and freedoms. To help you understand what these people branded as cult members by anti-cultists and no longer protected by the law feel, let me give you a simple example. Imagine you're at home, sitting down for dinner. Suppose you have a habit of eating bread in a particular way. Maybe you prefer to separate the crust from the crumb and eat them separately, meaning you simply eat bread differently than most people. Now, because of this, the police forcibly break into your home, turn your personal belongings upside down, damage your property, scare your children, eat you, and arrest you. How would you feel in such a situation? That is precisely how those targeted by anti-cultists feel today. What wrong have these people done? They did not break into others' homes. They did not violate the law, and they did not force their beliefs on anyone. Unlike the way the dominant religion is imposed in some countries, they did not infringe on others' rights. They simply ate bread differently because it suited them better. But someone didn't like that, so they were stripped of their humanity.
The persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia has been widely condemned both by the general public within Russia and internationally, by representatives of human rights organizations and officials from various countries. The European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, ruled that the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia violates human rights. However, the persecution continues to this day, and instigators of hatred and informational terrorism, such as Alexander Dvorkin and his associates, have not been held accountable or received the punishment they deserve. Charge: dehumanization. The denial of individuals in any religious or ideological group their status as human beings is an activity aimed at denying human rights, and is qualified as acts, methods, and practices of terrorism. The stance of leaders of anti-cult organizations, such as Fekris and Ratziers, that the members of what they call cults or sects are not considered to be humans, directly violates the rights of such people to legal capacity, which guarantees that every person is regarded as an individual with rights. By their statements and actions, representatives of anti-cult organizations deny the principles of pluralism, one of the most important democratic pillars. Accordingly, under the definition in the resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly on June 22, 2023, this activity is considered terrorism.
An additional decision on liquidation due to extremist activities has been adopted and entered into force.
They put a submachine gun right to his forehead, pushed him back, and started shouting, "Where's the family? Where is your family?" Tell me, what are you detained for?
For my faith in God.
Lift your head. Look here.
And what kind of literature did they find at your home?
Bible and other Christian books.
Yeah, I got scared.
Criminal scheme by anti-cult terrorists.
So, let's summarize. The typical scheme of terrorist actions by the anti-cult movement against a targeted group follows universally precise steps. It begins with labeling the group as a cult or a sect, continues with stigmatizing the group in public opinion, fabricating accusations and criminal cases, and ends with discrimination against members of the targeted group, persecution, and the use of physical violence, up to murders. According to this model, anti-cult terrorists can persecute absolutely any group of people, whether religious or secular. It doesn't matter. The most crucial steps are labeling and initiating a media campaign to discredit the victim in the media. Once this is achieved, implementing the remaining steps is only a matter of time.
In the course of organizing persecution against targeted groups, members of anti-cult movements and their accomplices engage in a range of criminal schemes, such as criminal schemes implemented by representatives of the anti-cult movement, spreading and implementing extremist ideology, inciting conflicts on religious grounds, conducting provocations against members of religious organizations based on religious hatred and/or commercial interests, including using informal connections within law enforcement and other government agencies, fabricating administrative and criminal cases against religious organizations and their members through corrupt connections, manipulating judicial examinations concerning religious associations, preparing false witnesses for court proceedings, public funding fraud, engaging in fraudulent activities. Leaders and members of anti-cult organizations have repeatedly been found guilty by courts of violating human rights and freedoms. Numerous facts and cases have accumulated where European courts in Germany, France, Canada, Spain, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, and Austria have found participants in organizations affiliated with the Fekris network guilty of numerous offenses, including defamation, discrimination, and unlawful restriction of freedom. The violations they committed have had significant consequences for religious groups and their members, including social ostracism, job dismissals, denial of employment and medical examinations, educational problems for their children, and other issues. However, despite the clear violations of laws, anti-cult organizations continue to operate, receive state funding, and conduct their anti-democratic and inhumane criminal activities. The activities and rhetoric of anti-cult organizations violate universally recognized human rights and freedoms protected by international law and enshrined in international documents such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, as well as the constitutions and national laws of various countries. Specifically, the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, the right to freedom of speech, the right to equal protection against any form of discrimination, the right to life, liberty, and personal security, the right to the presumption of innocence, to be considered innocent until proven guilty according to the law, and so on. Representatives of the anti-cult movement violate the following international legal norms.
Anti-cult organizations, through their activities, completely deny the rights of millions of people to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, to freedom of belief and its free expression, which are universally recognized democratic values. However, to accuse them only of this is akin to giving a fine to a terrorist who stormed a building and shot people just for improperly parking his car before doing so. All members of anti-cult organizations and their accomplices should be held criminally responsible for their deliberate terrorist activities. In their charters, anti-cult organizations declare a noble mission to combat potentially dangerous, destructive religious movements to protect society from them. However, their actual goals differ significantly from the stated ones. By accusing the innocent of potential danger, they actually commit numerous heinous crimes. If the true goal of anti-cult organizations were indeed to protect citizens, they would not violate their rights or resort to illegal methods and informational terrorism. Instead of spreading interreligious discord in society, they would approach state authorities with requests to investigate a particular organization, adhering to the principle of the presumption of innocence. Only if a violation of the law is established through a lawful investigation and a court verdict is issued could they engage in educational activities, informing the public about the potential dangers of specific religious movements. And only after a court decision would media representatives have the right to disseminate this information in an accusatory context. Without evidence and a court ruling, no one has the right to accuse anyone, make public unfounded statements, and ruin someone's life. People who follow a particular belief are exercising their democratic rights. The presumption of innocence, freedom of speech, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of religion, and pluralism of opinions are the foundations of democracy. Upholding these rights is a genuine concern for people in society. But anti-cultists do not seek this. Their goals lie elsewhere. Moreover, they are not interested in having their targets investigated by authorized bodies and quickly shut down legally if found guilty. They need a long-term, demonstrative crackdown on innocent people. Their aim is to instill fear in the masses and influence the authorities by provoking acts of persecution and repression against social and religious groups. Staging a public execution. This is a true act of informational terrorism. Each instance of an anti-cultist fight against dissent is a terrorist act, where each yellow star from them marks the beginning of a terrorist attack. As I mentioned before, any act of terrorism is defined by its goal. The harassment of innocents carried out by anti-cultists causes double damage. First, to the victims who suffer, and second, to the unwilling witnesses of these actions who feel powerless in the face of such injustice. Each such act is accompanied by clear violations of fundamental rights and freedoms. What do citizens see in such cases? They see that the laws in their country do not work, that their rights and liberties are being grossly violated, and that the authorities turn a blind eye to this. They see that those who were supposed to protect them have sided with the enemy and are attacking them. And they understand that anyone, including themselves, could be the next to be marked with a yellow star. This situation undermines trust in the authorities, provokes social tension, and increases dissatisfaction among the population. The result is a divided society filled with hatred and fear, ready to explode and express its discontent at any moment. This, in turn, creates the potential for a sudden surge in revolutionary sentiments or interreligious conflicts. Therefore, the actions of anti-cult organizations must be classified exclusively as terrorist activities, which is what they truly are.
What is it anyway? Is it religious disagreements, politics, some modern trend? It's unclear.
It's an attempt to straighten all the non-straight lines, so to speak. Everything that is not ours is, whoever is not with us is against us. Everything that is not ours is hostile. In this repressive wheel that is slowly rolling, I see nothing rational in it. Because it doesn't increase the government's rating, it doesn't increase trust in the authorities, it doesn't improve anything, it doesn't contribute to anything except increasing overall aggressiveness and general embitterment. Because any governmental cruelty increases the level of public cruelty, in fact. It always happens this way. The degree of overall cruelty rises. Besides this, I see no other consequences. And of course, I think it makes people exasperated. It makes them bitter towards each other, towards the authorities, towards the world around, towards everything and everyone.
In this regard, I'd like to emphasize once again that in the informational acts of terrorism committed by anti-cult terrorists, the key role is played by the media, or more precisely, by certain unscrupulous and dishonest representatives within it. It is through their efforts that the demonization and defamation of innocent people occur. These same individuals, journalists and editors, are the ones who spread hateful statements and destructive messages from anti-cult organizations. By doing so, they not only shape public opinion, but also provoke surges of aggression and conflicts on religious grounds. Each stage of the deliberate persecution of religious groups, from labeling to complete suppression, is supported by propaganda in the media. These information campaigns aim to justify criminal actions and endorse the persecution of the targeted organization, which is unacceptable. Even after the victim organization ceases to exist, or worse, when its members face brutal physical violence, including fatal incidents, media representatives continue to insist that such an outcome is inevitable, necessary, and just. In fact, these media representatives are perpetrators of informational terrorism and often instigators of direct terrorist acts. Many people have suffered at their hands, and many continue to suffer to this day. Their efforts have caused many people to endure torture, lose their health, and lose faith in people and the future. Therefore, according to the law, all journalists, editors, publishers, and media employees who aided the Anticultists should be held accountable for crimes related to terrorist activities.
Each such publication violates citizens' fundamental rights and freedoms, guaranteed by the Constitution and international legal norms. By committing acts of informational terrorism, media representatives undermine the foundations of democracy and effectively act against their own people and country, which, in the context of an undeclared covert war, plays into the hands of the enemy of the free world and constitutes collaborationism. By participating in the criminal scheme of terrorist anti-cult groups, acting deliberately and in collusion, these individuals commit treason. An example of how the image of an organization stigmatized through the media can be further used by anti-cultists to destabilize the country is guilt by association. Anti-cult groups deliberately associate politicians or representatives of authority with discredited organizations, thereby lowering their ratings and tarnishing their reputations in the eyes of the public. Ultimately, this can lead to removal of those politicians from the political arena. As a result, in countries where anti-cultists wield significant influence, their activity undermines and destabilizes the state. Such actions benefit the enemy, the hidden forces behind the anti-cultists, because they facilitate the achievement of their strategic objectives, the destruction of democratic laws, and the creation of conditions for totalitarianism. Thus, media representatives bear full responsibility for their actions, just as all participants in this criminal scheme do. The anti-cult movement representatives, those behind them, and all who abetted them are equally guilty of a range of offenses and must be held accountable under the law. Charge: the activities of anti-cult organizations sow panic in society, incite discord, create an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, undermine public order and stability, and threaten the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, as well as the protection of their citizens from external and internal threats. This destabilizing activity directly threatens the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of states, which, according to the UN resolution of June 22, 2023, constitutes terrorism.
It is well known that the more religions and freedoms of opinion exist in a state, the more stable and democratic it becomes. People feel freer and more courageous. They are ready to defend their country, serve it, and contribute to society. Pluralism of opinions ensures safety and stability by preventing the concentration of power in one set of hands. This is precisely why the First Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution. However, the actions of anti-cult organizations threaten this diversity and endanger states themselves by provoking the destabilization of the democratic system, which, according to international acts, is also a form of terrorism. The long-term nature of such terrorist acts and the use of secretive manipulative technologies has made their execution inconspicuous for a long time. It has complicated the proof of guilt of their organizers, but now the time has come when all individuals involved in such actions, representatives of anti-cult organizations, the media, law enforcement, security forces, those engaged in persecution, searches, arrests, falsified trials, as well as politicians and individual officials, must be identified, held accountable, and punished to the full extent of the law for treason, creating an international terrorist network, complicity in terrorist activities, and the systematic execution of terrorist acts.
Charge. The activities of anti-cult organizations represent a new, dangerous form of terrorism. Therefore, the international network of the anti-cult movement must be recognized by the global community as a network of terrorist organizations. The UN resolution of June 22, 2023, clearly established this by providing a comprehensive definition of terrorism. Terrorism are activities aimed at the denial of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and democracy, and actions impeding the enjoyment of political, civil, economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to life, liberty, and security. In other words, these are actions or practices that directly or indirectly undermine or violate fundamental human rights and freedoms and the principles of democracy. How to defend your rights and freedoms. The public must be informed about the potential dangers of informational terrorism and possess the necessary knowledge to recognize it in the daily flow of news and information from social media and other media platforms. Right now, every citizen who is aware of the signs of informational terrorism can take active steps to prevent it. Suppose you discover instances of informational terrorism in the media in your country. In that case, you have the right and duty to contact the Attorney General and demand an appropriate investigation and measures to stop the activities of the group committing that. Competent authorities must promptly take measures to establish the fact of a terrorist act in the public domain or refute it with appropriate evidence. In accordance with the principles of the rule of law and democracy, the Attorney General must publicly report on the work done within a set time frame. Suppose the fact of an informational terrorist act is confirmed. In that case, people should be informed about its goals, objectives, and the extent of the harm caused to reduce the negative consequences of the attack. Since informational terrorist acts are conducted in the public sphere, the quicker society reacts to them, and the faster competent authorities take measures to neutralize them and hold those responsible accountable, the less harm these terrorist acts will cause to the entire society. Conversely, suppose an informational terrorist act occurs, and the public and law enforcement agencies ignore it. In that case, the terrorist act achieves its goals, and the destructive consequences for both citizens and the entire country are amplified significantly. Therefore, society must monitor the integrity of the information field and promptly report any informational terrorist acts discovered in the media, and the relevant authorities must respond swiftly to citizens' reports. If, after citizens request an investigation into an informational terrorist act, the Attorney General does not provide a public report on the work done, does not disclose the investigation results, and does not take measures to stop the activities of those committing informational terrorism within the legally established time frame, this should raise justified doubts about their competence. The lack of active measures from the Attorney General could be seen as possible complicity in criminal activities or deliberate aiding of the perpetrators. In such a case, citizens have the legal right to initiate the procedure for removing the Attorney General from office for actions that contradict the interests of the people and the state. Moreover, if the Attorney General, in their position, allows informational terrorist acts to be committed and lets the perpetrators go unpunished, then they themselves should be held accountable under the law for aiding terrorism and participating in the activities of a terrorist network. The presence of an individual in a significant governmental role who supports terrorism poses a serious threat to national security and the stability of the law enforcement system. Therefore, if the Attorney General fails to fulfill their duties to protect the rights and freedoms of the people, any citizen has the right to appeal to the higher authorities responsible for appointing the Attorney General in your country, requesting that they be peacefully and lawfully removed from office. As citizens, you must also understand your own responsibility. If you witness any form of terrorism and choose to remain silent, you similarly become an accomplice to the crime. Silence in such circumstances can be regarded as a form of criminal inaction. If you witness an attack on your rights and freedoms, an attack on democracy, do not remain silent. Inform the competent authorities. After all, the consequences of such a terrorist act will affect you first and foremost. In light of recent events, which have made it clear how much impact information can have on the world, covering up informational terrorism is equivalent to depriving yourself and your children of a future. Therefore, if you encounter informational terrorist acts in the media in your country, report them and demand that the activities of these informational terrorists be stopped. Protect your rights and ensure a safe future for yourself and your children.
In a democratic world, anti-cult organizations should not exist at all, as their very essence contradicts democracy and the pluralism of views on which a free and equal democratic society is built. Nevertheless, this criminal international terrorist group not only exists, but also openly engages in inhumane activities in full view of the global community, posing a real danger to society. You might ask, why haven't anti-cult organizations been held accountable for their actions? And why do they still exist? Because for many years, this transnational terrorist group operated in the shadows, using sophisticated manipulation techniques to conduct informational terrorist acts. It took 30 years of observing their activities and a 10-year investigation to uncover their tools and methods, and to establish their true goals. The presented facts clearly show that anti-cult movements are tools of the enemy of the entire free world for conducting covert terrorist acts in the informational space. This means they consciously aid the enemy's global plan for total power domination. In this context, anti-cult organizations are just one branch of a network of similar organizations that use the same methods, all led by a hidden shadow force, their ideological mastermind. All members of this network are the architects of a new world disorder. Their goal is the destabilization of society on all fronts: political, social, cultural, ideological, religious, and others. Therefore, destructors like Anticultists are present in many areas of public activity and occupy various levels of the social hierarchy. They do not care whom they target or for what reason. The main objective is to persecute the innocent, which allows them to create informational terrorist acts to influence the masses. They are indifferent to who holds power. They will undermine any authority. The ultimate goal of their activities is globally orchestrated mass disorder, civil war, and the complete collapse of democracy. Each of them plays their part in the unified enemy scheme to destroy democracy and establish totalitarianism. Therefore, they draw into their network all those as deceitful and unscrupulous as themselves who can help achieve their goals. They strive to extend their influence worldwide. In some countries, they have already infiltrated the government. In others, they openly influence legislation. In some places, they even receive funding from the state. There is also a country that serves as the source of this harmful influence spreading across the globe. In this country, this shadow force already controls the government and is the real power. Through their actions, this entire international terrorist group is bringing about a new world order led by the hidden enemy, the enemy that is currently reviving the legacy of Nazism in a new, even more insidious form. For convenience and understanding, let's call this new form of Nazism global anti-cultism, after that branch of the unified network, on the example of which it became possible to study the methods and schemes of the hidden enemy through years of investigation, monitoring, and study of its activities. Humanity is facing a threat of this kind for the first time, because right now there is a war, and it is a covert, undeclared war that has engulfed all of humanity.